Now. Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the 2020 presidential election and presidential elections maybe more broadly, particularly the biggest or top 4 or 5 highest vote totals for a presidential candidate. Now, I think it's incredibly important, and I don't know what others think, but I think it's vitally important that the Trump administration, while they have the capacity to do so, shows clearly, proves with all the receipts that the 2020 election in various ways, for the Congress, the Senate, the House of Representatives, rather, the Senate, and of course the presidential election, how they were outrageously rigged, and there were millions upon millions of illegitimate votes that were counted, and that needs to be proven, and the public need to know just how powerful the deep state is and how far the deep state is prepared to go to subvert everything that we hold dear in the Western world. Free and fair elections, independent judiciary, the rule of law, due legal process. All of this, the globalists are trashing because it gets in their way. The power they need to implement the globalist project is total power over all things, and democracy, independent courts, and so on. That all gets in the way of the globalist project, and so they're looking to neutralize and subvert it, or remove it entirely, or compromise it. Now, the 2020 presidential election, sort of being, I guess, the apex of these considerations, does need to be shown, and quite obviously it does need to be shown to be the massive fraud it was. But going down to the details, how many illegitimate votes were there? How are these illegitimate votes counted? Because it wasn't just Democrats that were doing it. Some of the deep state Republicans were more than happy to join in with the Democrats in doing this huge voter fraud. The folks in Georgia and so on. So let's just have a look at it now. To just recount, Biden supposedly got 81 million votes. So we're looking at a guy who wasn't popular. He's an unimpressive speaker. He didn't campaign, and he could barely string a sentence together back then. Didn't campaign, again, unimpressive speaker. Didn't really do anything at all, and somehow he got the most votes by a country mile. By the way, he got the most votes for any presidential candidate in history. So the most votes ever. So he's the most popular president ever in the history of the United States, or that's what we're supposed to believe by the vote totals. Now, this is very, very hard to believe. Typically, a weak candidate like Biden, who doesn't campaign, unlike Trump, who was quite a vigorous and energetic campaigner, pulling large crowds. Whereas if Biden did make a public appearance, hardly anybody turned up. So if he was, exciting the electorate, then it was a very mysterious form of excitement. Trump, on the other hand, could fill stadiums with people outside trying to get in. So it's pretty obvious that the election was rigged and stolen. Now, to what extent we can sort of needs to be investigated, but that it was is without doubt. Now, if we look at the difference between, say, in an election, the weaker candidate to the most popular candidate, the winning candidate, you give or take, it's around, if you get a particularly popular candidate and a particularly weak candidate, you're looking at, give or take, 10 million votes would separate them. And you can see this, say, Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale, for example, Barack Obama and John McCain. There have been a few. A lot of the races are quite close, like John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, and that sort of thing. So a lot of these elections can be quite close. Some there's a very clear divide. Now, in the case of Biden being the very weak candidate in the 2020 election, Trump, by comparison, being the popular, very active, energetic candidate, it's reasonable to assume that Trump would come out in front, would win the race. Now, Biden got a very unusual large number of votes, very, very surprising, and in areas where he didn't campaign or didn't appear once, which again is surprising, whereas Trump would have campaigned in those areas multiple times. So it doesn't really add up. If you just look at the trend lines of how presidential elections go, you can pretty much track Obama, for example, particularly in the first term, he was a very energetic campaigner, crisscrossed the country, doing rallies and speeches all over the place, doing TV interviews and so on. He was very, very active, and he's quite a good speaker. He's got a good speaking voice and that sort of thing. So McCain, by example, wouldn't even have done half as much as Obama did, and is by comparison is much less impressive as a speaker. So the difference there, you would say, okay, well that's about what you expect, and this is what we would expect with Biden and Trump in 2020. But instead, it was the opposite. Biden beat Obama, who's the previous record holder, beat Obama's record by 12.5 million votes. I mean, like, wow, 12.5 million more votes than Obama. So he held the record, or established a new record by far. It wasn't just a little bit, or a few votes here or there. 12.5 million votes he beats Obama by. So this is very, very hard to believe, extremely hard to believe, and beats Trump, quite handsomely according to the vote totals. There's also a number of strange. There was 8 to 10 seats in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, that were very suspicious. And 2 or 3 Senate election races were also very suspicious in the amount of time it took to count them. The very mysterious number of postal votes that were still coming in weeks after the event. I mean, it's very, very strange, and quite obviously, in my view, corrupt to the core. Nonetheless, and the extent to which the deep state was nervous about it was how vicious they became in the January 6th stuff, and the way they ruthlessly pursued grannies who'd simply been in the Capitol, the Washington DC at around that time, and sending SWAT teams to chase them, and all sorts of harassment and suspending habeas corpus. They went absolutely ballistic on this, to try and illustrate, in their view, look how those bad people are trying to subvert democracy, when it was they were the subverters of democracy, not the people that were complaining about it. Now, my reckoning is that ballpark around 20 million votes were cooked up for Biden. I think in reality, Trump would have got 73 or 74 if it was in that election, and Biden would have got say 61, 62, somewhere in that region. So if Biden got 81 million votes, according to the corrupt and tampered with final tally, then that means they cooked up somewhere in the region of 20 million votes for him. Now, those votes, those corrupt votes, those illegitimate votes, they need to be found. Where did they come from? Who signed off on them? Who was involved? What election officials, what judges defended it, and what, and so on and so forth. It really needs to be an audit. I would argue something approaching a forensic audit, and that needs to be, I think, put down so it's absolutely crystal clear to everybody what happened and how the corrupt processes for cooking up these votes took. I mean, did they just get all the illegals and give them vote forms to send in as well? I mean, what did they do? I mean, that would be an obvious place to look. But again, it's somewhere in the order of 20 million. We're not talking a few thousand here or there. We're talking tens of millions of illegitimate votes were cast and counted and assigned, and that's a huge a lot of people have to be involved in that. It's not just one or two people or some little flunky out in the middle of, rural Alaska or something. We're talking about a major organised program that they put in place for some time. I think they already had it in place for Hillary, but it was still more embryonic and wasn't as widespread. They thought they could cook up a million or two votes, and that would be enough. I figured they cooked up 3 or 4 million for Hillary, and then Trump won in the swing states, which took them by surprise in 2016. So they weren't going to make that mistake again, and decide, okay, well, we have to just have massive fraud on a massive scale everywhere, and that's what they did. And again, the Senate, particularly the Senate, they didn't want to lose control of the House, because the House of Representatives would be the vehicle they could use for going to pursue Trump with these bullshit committees and so on, like Jan 6 committee and the like. And they didn't have a large majority there. And there's somewhere around, give or take, somewhere around 10 electoral districts that I think there was, that they might have fallen over the line, the Democrats anyway, by a couple of seats in the House, but they wanted to make sure. So I figure there was, give or take, 10 electoral districts where there was substantial voter fraud, and 2 or 3 Senate. They particularly wanted the Senate so they could appoint over 200 radical activist judges, which they did. All the judges that are trying to block Trump now, nearly all of them, I mean, there's a couple of them are Obama flunkies, but nearly all of them are Biden flunkies that were appointed. And these people aren't judges; they're just radical activists with some bullshit affirmative action law degree. So they needed the Senate to do that, and they got that. And I would suggest that was fraudulent as well. But it's not simply a matter of proving that Trump was robbed of the 2020 election. I mean, that's the fine. Okay, that's happened. That can't be reversed now. You can't go back in time for that. But it needs to be shown the extent that they're prepared to go to, the level of corruption, the amount of people involved in that corruption, how trust, or supposedly at least trusted public servants who've sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, etc., how they couldn't wait to get their hands as dirty as possible in all this corruption and all this vote rigging, and by thinking that they were righteous and virtuous in doing it. Now, so I reckon they cooked up a few million for Hillary, give or take 20 million for Biden. And the guy was unelectable, for fuck's sake, but he was a useful stooge for the globalists and performed that function for them. So give or take 20 million illegitimate votes for Biden. I would think I don't know how many they did for Kamala. Now, if you look at what was the third most in vote terms, who was the third most popular presidential candidate in the history of US president elections, the third most popular, Kamala Harris. Now, it would be difficult to find a less impressive candidate. Biden would give her a good run for her money, but it would be difficult to find a less impressive candidate for electoral office, the office of president in this case. And yet Kamala came within, 2 million, just under 2 million votes of Trump's total. I mean, you're kidding me, right? That didn't happen. No way that happened. So they cooked up a nice slab of votes for Kamala. Now, I would think 10 to 20 million votes were cooked up for her as well. Hard to say exactly how many, but we know it's a lot. There is no way Kamala got 75 million, whatever it was, votes. I mean, it didn't happen. So would she have got somewhere between 60 and 65 million? The die-hard Democrat, but sure, she should have got somewhere in that range. But no way she would have got the. Again, she came close to beating Trump in vote totals, and less successful in the swing states. But I only think because Trump did better in the swing states than they thought, and they hadn't put enough corrupt, illegitimate votes into those states. There's also a bit more scrutiny around this time than there was in 2020, so it would have been a little bit more difficult for them to do it. But if they'd done it and then taken control of the presidency, then they could have simply invented sham prosecutions to go after anybody who complained about it. Nonetheless, the corrupt vote machine created, from the time of Hillary onwards, has been creating millions of corrupt votes, from 2016 onwards. So this is the recent presidential election was the third time that mass voter fraud has taken place, and this needs to be laid bare and really needs to be exposed with receipts so people can see just how much is being stolen from them in terms of their political rights, and then downstream from that their legal rights and their right to due legal process and so on. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.